Lisa Rodriguez sat at her station aboard the research vessel New Horizon, watching the endless stars through the viewport. She had been monitoring deep space communications for 3 years now, and most days brought nothing but static and the occasional burst from distant pulsars. Today felt different, though, as a weak signal crackled through her headset that made her sit up straight. The transmission was faint, almost lost in the background noise of space, but it carried patterns that her trained ear recognized as artificial. Lisa quickly adjusted her equipment, trying to clean up the signal while her heart began to race. In all her years of listening to the cosmos, she had never heard anything like this before. "Dr. Carter, you need to hear this," she called out to the ship's language expert, who was working at a nearby console. Alan Carter looked up from his own research, saw the excitement on Lisa's face, and hurried over to her station. Alan put on the spare headset and listened carefully as Lisa played back the recording. His eyes grew wide as he heard the strange sounds that definitely came from some kind of intelligence. The patterns were too complex and organized to be natural phenomena, but they were unlike any human language he had ever studied. "This is incredible," Alan whispered as he began running the signal through his analysis programs. "Whatever this is, it's definitely coming from an intelligence, but the structure is completely alien to anything in our databases." Captain Jake Morrison heard the commotion and walked over to see what had captured his communications team's attention. Jake was a practical man who had spent 20 years exploring the outer reaches of human space, but he had always wondered if humanity was truly alone in the universe. "What do you have for me?" Jake asked as he looked at the data streaming across Lisa's screens. "Sir, we're receiving what appears to be an artificial transmission from approximately 47 light-years away," Lisa reported. "Dr. Carter is working on translation now, but the signal strength suggests it's being broadcast with enormous power." Alan worked frantically at his computer, using every linguistic analysis tool at his disposal. The alien language seemed to follow logical patterns, and he began to identify what might be grammatical structures and repeated elements. After 2 hours of intense work, he started to make progress. "Captain, I think I'm getting something," Alan said, his voice trembling with excitement and concern. "This appears to be some kind of distress call. The beings sending this message call themselves the Velani, and they're asking for help." As Alan continued his translation work, a clearer picture began to emerge. The Velani described themselves as a peaceful species that lived in the oceans of their homeworld, which they called Aquinas Prime. They were scholars and healers who had developed advanced technology through cooperation and scientific discovery rather than warfare. But now their world was under attack by something called the Krex Empire. Velani's message painted a terrifying picture of ruthless conquerors who had already destroyed 17 other civilizations. The Krex seemed to live only for war and conquest, enslaving or killing every species they encountered. "They're completely defenseless," Alan explained to Captain Morrison as he continued translating. "The Velani have no military, no weapons. Designed for warfare, nothing that could stand against an organized attack. They're broadcasting this message to anyone who might be listening, hoping that somewhere in the galaxy there might be a species willing and able to help them." Jake stared at the translated message on Alan's screen, feeling the weight of what they had discovered. This was humanity's first contact with alien life, and it came in the form of a desperate plea for help from beings who were about to be destroyed by an enemy they couldn't fight. "How long do they have?" Jake asked. Alan checked the time stamps in the transmission. "Based on the information in their message, the Krex fleet will reach their homeworld in approximately 6 months. But Captain, this transmission was sent almost 2 years ago. By the time we could get there, even if we left immediately, it might already be too late." The bridge fell silent as the crew absorbed this information. Lisa continued monitoring for any additional transmissions while Alan worked to extract every piece of information he could from the original message. The Velani had included technical data about their location, their species, and what little they knew about their attackers. Jake made his decision quickly. Lisa, prepare a full report on this transmission and send it directly to Earth Command with Priority 1 classification. Include all of Dr. Carter's translation work and analysis. Sir, are we really going to get involved in an alien war? Lisa asked. I don't know yet, Jake replied honestly. But if someone is asking for help against bullies, we need to at least consider what we can do. The message to Earth Command included everything they had learned about the Velani and the Krex Empire. Jake also included his own recommendation that humanity should at least investigate the situation, even if they ultimately decided not to intervene. Admiral Kate Sullivan received the transmission at Earth Command headquarters 3 days later. She immediately called an emergency meeting of the Defense Council, knowing that this discovery would change everything for humanity. The debate that followed was intense, with some arguing that humanity should focus on its own expansion and development rather than getting involved in alien conflicts. But there were others who felt that if humanity was going to join a larger galactic community, they needed to establish themselves as a species that could be trusted to help others in need. Colonel Ryan Hayes, Earth's most decorated Marine commander, volunteered to lead a small expeditionary force to investigate the situation. If we ignore this plea for help, what does that say about who we are as a species? Ryan argued during the council meeting. These beings reached out across the void, asking for someone, anyone, to help them survive. If we have the ability to help and choose not to, how are we any better than the Krex who are attacking them? The decision was made to send a small task force under Colonel Hayes' command to make contact with any surviving Velani and assess the situation. If there was still time to help, humanity would make its first intervention in galactic affairs, not as conquerors, but as protectors of those who couldn't protect themselves. Colonel Ryan Hayes stood on the bridge of the destroyer Iron Wolf as it dropped out of hyperspace near the coordinates the Velani had provided in their distress call. What he saw through the viewport took his breath away. Floating in space before them was a massive structure, unlike anything humanity had ever built, stretching for kilometers in every direction, like a metallic city among the stars. Sir, we're receiving multiple communications from that station, reported Lieutenant Lisa Park from the communications console. They're in dozens of different languages, but our computers are detecting the Velani language patterns that Dr. Carter identified. Ryan nodded to his communications officer. Open a channel using the Velani language protocols. Let them know we're from Earth, and we received their distress call. The response came quickly, and Ryan could hear the excitement and disbelief in the alien voice even through the translation software. The being identified itself as Admiral Coral Song of Deep Waters of the Velani refugee fleet and invited the humans to dock at what they called Kepler Station Knot. As the Iron Wolf approached the docking bay, Ryan assembled his team. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mission's xenobiologist, checked her recording equipment one final time. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Johnson reviewed the tactical information they had gathered about the Krex Empire. Both officers were as nervous as Ryan felt about humanity's first face-to-face meeting with alien life. The docking bay was enormous, clearly designed to accommodate ships much larger than anything humanity had built. As they walked through the airlock, Ryan's team found themselves in a vast chamber filled with beings that looked like nothing from Earth's oceans, or Imagination. Admiral Coral Song of Deep Waters was clearly Velani, with smooth blue-green skin. That seemed to shimmer like water and large eyes that reflected light like a dolphin's. The Velani moved with fluid grace, even in the artificial environment of the station, and Ryan could see why they had described themselves as ocean dwellers. But the Velani we're not alone. As Admiral Coral Song led them deeper into the station, Ryan's team encountered dozens of different species. Dr. Vasquez was amazed by the diversity of life forms, from the crystalline beings called lithans, who seemed to be made of living gemstone, to the strange gas cloud creatures called ethereals, who appeared to exist partially in another dimension. "Welcome, warriors of Earth," Admiral Coral Song said through the translation device. "We had hoped that someone would answer our call, but we never imagined that help would come from so far away." Ryan noticed that many of the other aliens stopped, what they were doing to stare at the humans as they passed. Some seemed curious, others appeared frightened, but all of them looked at the human military equipment and weapons with expressions Ryan couldn't quite read. Admiral Coral Song led them to a large chamber where representatives from many species had gathered. As Ryan looked around the room, he began to understand why these beings needed help so desperately. None of them looked like fighters. The Velani were clearly adapted for life in peaceful oceans. The crystalline lithans seemed fragile, despite their mineral composition, and the plant-like Verdani appeared to spend most of their time photosynthesizing rather than moving. "We are grateful that you have come," Admiral Coral Song began, "but we must be honest with you. The situation is worse than when we first sent our distress call. The Krex Empire has conquered 3 more systems since then, and their fleet grows, stronger with each victory." Lieutenant Colonel Johnson leaned forward. "Tell us about these Krex. What are their capabilities? How do they fight?" The question seemed to disturb many of the alien representatives. A Lithan speaker, whose crystalline body chimed softly when it moved, provided the answer. "The Krex are unlike any species we have encountered. They seem to exist only for conquest and destruction. Their technology is advanced, but more importantly, they appear to enjoy causing suffering." Dr. Vasquez asked about the evolutionary history of the species in the room, and the answers she received explained everything. In this part of the galaxy, evolution had favored cooperation and intelligence over aggression. Species that developed warfare tended to destroy themselves before achieving space travel, so only the peaceful ones survived to join galactic civilization. "We have never needed to fight," Admiral Coral Song explained. "When conflicts arose between our peoples, we solved them through negotiation and compromise. The concept of organized violence for territorial gain is completely foreign to us." Ryan and his team exchanged glances. This explained why these advanced civilizations with incredible technology were helpless against the Krex invasion. They had never developed military thinking, strategy, or tactics because they had never needed them. "What about defensive weapons?" Marcus asked. "Surely you have some way to protect yourselves." An ethereal representative, whose cloudy form shifted, colors as it spoke, answered this question. "Our weapons are designed for precision work, scientific research, or emergency situations. We have tools that can cut through matter or generate energy, but nothing designed specifically to harm other intelligent beings." Ryan began to understand the scope of the problem. These species had technology that in many ways surpassed humanity's, but they had never weaponized it effectively because the concept of warfare was alien to their peaceful nature. They were like brilliant scientists who had never considered that their knowledge could be used for violence. "Tell us about your history with the Krex," Ryan requested. "How long have they been expanding? What do they want?" The story that emerged was terrifying. The Krex Empire had appeared 2 centuries ago and had been steadily expanding ever since. They seemed to have no interest in negotiation, trade, or coexistence. They simply conquered each system they encountered, enslaving useful populations and destroying the rest. "They take our technology, our resources, and our people," Admiral Coral Song said sadly. "But worse than that, they seem to enjoy the process of conquest itself. Intercepted communications suggest that they view warfare as an art form and take pride in the psychological suffering they cause. Dr. Vasquez had been taking detailed notes on everything they learned. Have any species successfully resisted them? The silence that followed answered her question before anyone spoke. A Verdani representative, whose bark-like skin was marked with worry lines, finally responded. A few species have managed to delay their conquest for months or even years, but none have ever stopped the Krek's advance. They are simply too organized, too ruthless, and too experienced in warfare. Ryan realized that humanity was being offered a chance to fight an enemy that had never been defeated, using military skills that no other species in this part of the galaxy possessed. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to save civilizations that had no way to save themselves. We need to see their military capabilities, Marcus said. Do you have any recordings of Krek's attacks or battle footage we can analyze? Admiral Coral Song provided them with extensive records of Krek's military operations. As Ryan's team reviewed the footage, they began to see patterns and weaknesses that the peaceful alien species had missed. The Kreks were effective against civilian populations and unprepared defenders, but their tactics were predictable to minds trained in military strategy. They're bullies, Ryan concluded after hours of analysis. They're used to fighting enemies who don't fight back effectively. But they've never faced an opponent that was specifically designed by evolution to be good at warfare. The alien representatives didn't fully understand what Ryan meant, but they could see the confidence in his voice. For the first time since the Krek's expansion had begun, someone was looking at their enemy without fear, but with the calculating gaze of a professional warrior planning a battle. The alarms on Kepler Station began wailing as Sergeant First Class Tony Martinez rushed to his battle station. Long-range sensors had detected a Krek scouting force approaching a Velani evacuation convoy, just 3 hours away from the refugee station. Colonel Hayes had ordered immediate deployment of human forces to intercept and protect the civilians. Tony led his squad of 12 Marines toward their assault shuttle, checking weapons and equipment one final time. Private First Class Amy Walsh ran diagnostics on their heavy weapons while Corporal Dan Foster reviewed the tactical data they had received about Krek ships and fighting methods. Remember what we learned from the battle footage, Tony told his squad as their shuttle raced toward the convoy. The Kreks expect their enemies to break and run when the shooting starts. They're not used to people who shoot back effectively. The Velani convoy consisted of 5 large transport ships carrying thousands of refugee families from recently conquered worlds. The ships were beautiful, but clearly not designed for combat, with smooth curves and artistic details that showed their builders' peaceful nature. They had no weapons and only basic shields designed to protect against space debris rather than enemy fire. Krek ships coming in fast, reported their pilot, Lieutenant Pete Barnes. 3 heavy cruisers and about a dozen smaller attack craft. They're moving to surround the convoy. Tony studied the tactical display and made his decision quickly. We're going to hit them from an angle they won't expect. Amy, prepare the boarding pods. We're going to take their flagship and turn their own weapons against them. The plan was insane by any reasonable military standard, but Tony had studied the Krek's battle recordings carefully. They relied on overwhelming firepower and psychological intimidation, but their ship designs suggested they had never faced enemies who fought back effectively. Their internal security was designed to control slaves, not repel military boarders. As their shuttle approached the battle, Tony could see the Krek ships opening fire on the helpless Velani transports. The alien ships had beautiful crystalline hulls that were already beginning to crack under the Krek's bombardment. Thousands of innocent lives hung in the balance. Execute boarding maneuver, Tony ordered as Lieutenant Barnes brought their shuttle in close to the Krek's flagship. The smaller Krek ships tried to intercept them, but Barnes flew with the aggressive skill of a pilot trained in Earth's chaotic atmosphere, pulling maneuvers that would have been impossible for beings who evolved on peaceful worlds. Amy's boarding pod punched through the Krex ship's hull with explosive force, and Tony's squad poured into the alien vessel ready for close combat. What they found surprised them. The Krex themselves were tall, armored beings with multiple arms and advanced personal weapons, but they fought like beings who had never faced truly desperate resistance. The first Krex warriors, Tony, encountered fired their energy weapons with deadly accuracy, but they seemed confused when the humans didn't retreat after taking casualties. Corporal Foster took a hit that would have killed most alien species, but he kept fighting with the stubborn endurance that Earth's harsh evolution had bred into humanity. They don't know how to handle enemies who keep fighting when they're hurt. Amy observed as she set charges on what appeared to be the ship's main weapon control system. Look at how they're positioning themselves. They expect us to break and run. Tony's squad fought through the Krex ship with a combination of tactics the aliens had never encountered. Where Krex warriors expected overwhelming firepower to end resistance, they found humans who used cover effectively and coordinated their attacks with military precision. Where they expected enemies to avoid dangerous areas of the ship, they found Marines who deliberately sought out the most defended positions. The psychological impact on the Krex crew was immediate and devastating. Intercepted communications revealed confusion and growing panic as they realized their enemies weren't behaving according to any pattern they understood. The humans seemed to actually enjoy the combat, becoming more aggressive as the fight continued rather than less. Target their command center, Tony ordered as his squad reached the ship's central corridor. If we can take their commander alive, we might be able to get intelligence on their overall strategy. The assault on the Krex command center became a brutal close-quarters battle that lasted for over an hour. The Krex had superior individual firepower and advanced armor, but the humans had something the aliens had never encountered: tactical coordination. Developed through millions of years of hunting in coordinated groups, Amy and Dan worked together to flank the Krex positions while Tony provided covering fire from a position that any sane being would have considered suicidal. The Krex couldn't understand how their enemies continued fighting effectively while exposed to deadly crossfire. When the Krex commander finally surrendered, his first words through the translation device were a question that would haunt him. What kind of beings are you that you fight harder when you are wounded? With the flagship under human control, Tony's squad turned its weapons against the rest of the Krex force. The alien ships had been designed to fight enemies who couldn't effectively fight back, not to handle attacks from their own weapons operated by minds trained in military tactics. Use their own ship's sensors to coordinate targeting, Tony ordered, as Amy took control of the alien weapon systems. Show them what their guns can do when operated by people who know how to use them properly. The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Krex ships found themselves under attack from weapons they understood perfectly, but used with tactics they couldn't predict or counter. Their formations, designed to intimidate and overwhelm peaceful opponents, became death traps when faced. With coordinated military strikes, within 2 hours, the entire Krex scouting force had been destroyed or captured. Not a single Velani transport had been lost, though several showed damage from the initial attack. The convoy was safe, but more importantly, word of the battle began spreading through both refugee and Krex communication networks. Dr. Elena Vasquez, monitoring communications from Kepler Station, realized the larger implications of what had happened. Colonel, the psychological impact of this battle is spreading through the entire refugee population. For the first time in 2 centuries, someone has not just survived a Krex attack, but completely defeated it. The Velani began calling humans the Stormbringers, while the crystalline Lithans composed harmonic poems about the warriors from the Death World. Even more significant was the intercepted Krex communications. which revealed confusion and growing concern among their military commanders. "They're trying to understand how we can maintain morale while taking casualties," Colonel Hayes reported to Earth Command. "Their entire military psychology is based on the assumption that any species will break when faced with sufficient force. They've never encountered an enemy that actually becomes more dangerous when threatened." But the most important discovery came from Dr. Vasquez's analysis of the battle, footage and subsequent interviews with rescued refugees. Earth, with its extreme weather patterns, natural disasters, and ecosystem full of apex predators, had created something unique in this part of the galaxy, a species specifically adapted for warfare. Every other species we've encountered evolved as either prey animals or passive predators, Elena explained to the assembled refugee leaders. Humans are the only species that made a career out of hunting other apex predators. We're persistence. Hunters who can track prey across continents, adapt to any environment, and never give up. The revelation changed everything for the refugee species. They began to understand that humanity represented something they had never seen before, a species that was naturally good at organized violence, but chose to use that ability to protect others rather than conquer them. Admiral Coral Song of Deep Waters summed up the new situation perfectly during the victory celebration on Kepler Station. "For 2 centuries, we have lived in fear of the Kreks because we could not fight them effectively. Now we have allies who are not just capable of fighting, but who seem to have been created by their world specifically for this purpose. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when someone finally said no to the Kreks Empire and meant it." Kreks Fleet Commander Zarthok stared at the battle reports from the refugee convoy attack with growing fury and confusion. In 2 centuries of conquest, no enemy force had ever completely destroyed a Kreks scouting fleet while suffering minimal losses themselves. The beings calling themselves humans had done the impossible, and now every species in the sector was talking about the Deathworlders who had finally stood up to the Empire. "Bring me everything we know about these humans," Zarthok commanded his intelligence officers. "I want to understand what we're dealing with before we crush them." The reports that followed painted a disturbing picture. The humans came from a world called Earth that seemed designed to create warriors. Their planet had extreme weather that could kill the unprepared, natural disasters that struck without warning, and an ecosystem where every creature was either predator or prey. Most shocking of all, the humans had spent their entire history fighting each other in increasingly sophisticated wars. "They have professional soldiers," reported Intelligence Officer Krell Vax, his voice showing the confusion that had become common when discussing humans. "Beings whose only job is to fight and kill. They train for combat even when no war is happening. This concept is completely alien to our experience." Zarthok made his decision quickly. The humans represented a threat to everything the Kreks Empire had built. If other species began to think they could resist effectively, the entire structure of Kreks dominance would collapse. He would assemble the largest fleet the Empire had ever deployed and make an example that would terrify the galaxy into submission. "Gather every available ship," Zarthok ordered. "I want 300 vessels minimum. We will destroy these humans so thoroughly that no species will ever again dare to challenge us." Meanwhile, on Kepler Station, Captain Rachel Stone of the cruiser Defiant was reviewing intelligence reports about the approaching Kreks fleet. The refugees had provided excellent information about Kreks ship capabilities and typical tactics, but the force heading toward them was larger than anything the Empire had deployed in decades. "They're bringing everything they have," reported her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Steve Parker. 300 ships, including their newest heavy battlecruisers. They want to make sure we don't survive to inspire any more resistance." Rachel studied the tactical display showing the gas giant system where they had chosen to make their stand. The shattered rings as the locals called them, were the remains of ancient moons that had broken apart eons ago, creating a maze of asteroids and debris that could provide cover for smaller ships. It was the perfect place for an outnumbered, forced to fight a defensive battle. "How many ships do we have?" Rachel asked, though she already knew the answer would be depressing. 15 human vessels and about 30 alien ships that the refugees managed to arm with basic weapons, Steve replied. "The alien crews are brave, but they have no real combat experience." The odds were hopeless by any reasonable calculation. But Rachel had studied the battle recordings from the convoy rescue. The humans had advantages that couldn't be measured in simple numbers. They had tactical flexibility, aggressive leadership, and most importantly, they had the willingness to make sacrifices that their enemies couldn't understand. "Pass the word to all ships," Rachel ordered. "We're going to use tactics the Kreks have never faced. They expect us to try to preserve our ships and minimize casualties. Instead, we're going to hit them so hard that they break psychologically before they can use their numerical advantage." The Battle of the Shattered Rings began when Zarthok's massive fleet entered the gas giant system, expecting to find the humans cowering behind the asteroids. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that attacked immediately and aggressively, using the debris field as cover for hit-and-run strikes that came from unexpected directions. Rachel led the human fleet in a series of coordinated attacks that prioritized enemy morale over strategic targets. Instead of trying to destroy the most dangerous Krek ships, they focused on creating spectacular explosions and dramatic losses that would be visible to the entire enemy fleet. "Target their command ships," Rachel ordered as the Defiant launched. A full spread of missiles at a Krek's heavy cruiser. "Make them think about how many of their leaders we can kill before this is over." Lieutenant Commander Parker led a boarding party against a Krek's battleship that had been damaged by asteroid impacts. His team fought through sections of the alien ship that the Kreks themselves considered too dangerous to occupy, showing once again that humans could function in environments that would kill most other species. "They're fighting in areas of their own ship that they've sealed off," Parker reported over the comm system. "The radiation levels here would be fatal to most species, but we can handle it with our protective gear." The Kreks found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to ignore risks that any sensible being would avoid. Where they expected the humans to retreat when faced with superior firepower, they found Marines who deliberately sought out the most heavily defended positions. Where they expected fear when faced with overwhelming odds, they found opponents who seemed to become more dangerous as the situation grew more desperate. Chief Petty Officer Nancy Clark, monitoring the battle from the engineering section of the Defiant, realized the key to victory. The Krek's fleet was powerful but inflexible, designed to overwhelm enemies through superior numbers rather than tactical brilliance. They had never faced an opponent willing to sacrifice strategic assets for tactical advantage. "Captain," Nancy called over the comm system, "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." Rachel listened to Nancy's proposal and understood immediately what her engineer was suggesting. It was insane, suicidal, and exactly the kind of move that no Krek's commander would ever expect from a rational opponent. "Do it," Rachel ordered without hesitation. "All hands, prepare for ramming speed." The Defiant accelerated directly toward the center of the Krek's formation, its reactor overloading as Nancy pushed the engines beyond their safety limits. The Krek's fleet scattered in confusion, unable to understand why any commander would deliberately destroy their own flagship in what appeared to be a fit of madness. The explosion when the Defiant's reactor detonated destroyed dozens of Krek's vessels and created a massive electromagnetic pulse that disabled many more. But more importantly, it broke the psychological foundation of Krek's military doctrine. Their entire strategy was based on the assumption that enemies would try to preserve themselves above all else. They sacrificed their command ship just to hurt us, Zarthok said in disbelief as he watched the expanding fireball consume a significant portion of his fleet. What kind of beings choose death over retreat? The surviving human ships, now under the command of Captain Danny Foster aboard the cruiser Vengeance, pressed their attack with renewed fury. The alien crews that had been fighting alongside the humans found courage they didn't know they possessed, inspired by the example of beings willing to die to protect others. The battle turned into a rout as the Krek's fleet began to retreat in disorder. Ships that had conquered 17 star systems fled before a force a tenth their size, their crews' morale shattered by an enemy that fought according to rules they couldn't comprehend. Zarthok himself was captured when his flagship suffered critical damage and was boarded by a combined human and alien assault team. As he was led away in restraints, he asked the question that would haunt Krek's military thinking for years to come. Why do you fight so hard for beings who are not even your own species? He demanded. What do you gain from protecting those who cannot protect themselves? The human Marine escorting him, Sergeant Linda Murphy, gave him an answer that perfectly captured humanity's role in the galaxy. Because someone has to, she said simply. And it looks like that someone is us. The interrogation of Zarthok revealed intelligence that changed everything the refugees thought they knew about the war. The Krek's empire was not just expanding for conquest and resources. They were fleeing from something even worse in their home region of space, building up military strength for a war against an enemy called the Devourers. They're not the real threat, Colonel Hayes reported to Earth Command after reviewing the intelligence. The Kreks are trying to build an empire strong enough to fight something that scares them more than we do. The revelation meant that humanity's war was just beginning, and the real enemy was still coming. 6 months after the Battle of the Shattered Rings, the galaxy had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. General Patricia Moore stood in the command center of the new Galactic Defense Initiative, watching training exercises where Velani aquatic assault units worked alongside human Marines and crystalline Lithan support teams. The sight would have been impossible to imagine before humanity arrived to answer an alien distress call. The changes went far beyond simple military cooperation. The human example had inspired species throughout the refugee sectors to develop their own defense capabilities. The Velani had created underwater combat units that could operate in environments no other species could survive. The Lithans had learned to weaponize their harmonic abilities for non-lethal crowd control that could disable enemy equipment without killing. Status report on the integrated training program, Patricia requested from her aide, Colonel Ben Adams. We now have volunteer defense forces from 47 species, Ben reported with pride. The Ethereals are providing reconnaissance capabilities that can penetrate any known stealth technology, while the Verdani have developed biological weapons that can disable Krek's technology without harming organic life. The key breakthrough had come when Dr. Elena Vasquez realized that humanity's greatest contribution wasn't just tactical knowledge, but something more fundamental, the warrior's mindset. The concept of fighting not for personal survival, but for the protection of others, had spread through the refugee communities like wildfire. Captain Danny Foster's special operations teams worked with alien volunteers in training facilities that had been impossible to imagine before first contact. Humans taught combat techniques, but more importantly, they taught the philosophy of sacrifice for the greater good that had made their species effective warriors. The Ethereal Scouts report that they've identified the Devourer Advance Fleet, reported Commander Lisa Brooks from the intelligence section. Long-range sensors confirm what Zarthok told us. They're not organic beings at all, but some kind of machine intelligence that consumes organic life to fuel their expansion. The revelation about the Devourers had changed everything. The interrogation of captured Krex officers revealed that their empire's expansion had been driven by desperation rather than simple aggression. The Devourers had appeared in Krek space centuries ago, consuming entire worlds and converting organic matter into more machines. The Kreks had been trying to build a military force strong enough to resist them. "How much time do we have?" Patricia asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. "Based on their current rate of advancement, the Devourer fleet will reach this sector in approximately 18 months, Lisa replied. "But General, their technology is unlike anything we've encountered. They adapt to weapons used against them and incorporate destroyed ships into their own fleet." Patricia nodded grimly. The challenge ahead made the war against the Krex Empire look simple by comparison. But she had learned something important about humanity's role in the galaxy. During the past months of building the Defense Initiative, humans weren't just good at fighting. They were good at inspiring others to fight for something greater than themselves. The breakthrough came during a joint planning session where Colonel Ryan Hayes, now bearing the scars of a dozen battles against Krex holdout forces, addressed the Galactic Council. Representatives from over 100 species had gathered to hear humanity's proposal for facing the Devourer threat. "We've learned something important during our time in your galaxy," Ryan began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led beings through impossible battles. The Krex Empire, for all its brutality, was trying to solve the right problem with the wrong methods. They thought they could build strength through conquest and fear. But real strength comes from beings who choose to fight together for something they believe in. The speech that followed became legendary throughout the galaxy. Ryan proposed an alliance that would include not just the refugee species, but reformed elements of the Krex Empire itself. The idea was radical beyond anything the galaxy had seen. Former enemies working together against a threat that could destroy them all. "We didn't come to your galaxy to conquer it," Ryan declared to the assembled representatives. "We came to make sure it stays free. The Devourers represent everything we stand against: the destruction of life, the elimination of choice, the end of hope. If we're going to stop them, we need every species, every ship, and every warrior who's willing to fight for the right of organic life to exist." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Species that had been enemies for generations began working together under human strategic leadership. Even former Krex commanders, freed from their empire's brutal hierarchy, volunteered to share their military knowledge and fight alongside their former victims. The training programs that followed pushed the boundaries of what anyone thought possible. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Johnson found himself teaching former Krex warriors how to fight as part of a team rather than as individual conquerors. The psychological adjustment was difficult, but Marcus discovered that even the Krex responded to the human concept of fighting for others rather than personal glory. "It's remarkable," Dr. Elena Vasquez reported during one of her regular briefings to Earth Command. The Krex were trapped in a military culture that emphasized individual dominance and fear-based leadership. When we introduced them to cooperative tactics and shared sacrifice, their effectiveness increased dramatically. The real test came when the first Devourer scout ships appeared at the edge of the sector. Unlike the Krex vessels, which were clearly designed by organic minds for organic crews, the Devourer ships looked like geometric nightmares that seemed to shift and change as they moved. They absorbed energy weapons that struck them and incorporated destroyed material into their own hulls. Captain Amy Walsh, now commanding the heavy cruiser Thunderbolt, led the first engagement against a Devourer probe ship. The battle lasted 14 hours and required tactics that no single species could have developed alone. Ethereal scouts provided targeting data that penetrated the enemy's adaptive camouflage, while lithium harmonic weapons disrupted the machine intelligence's coordination systems. "They adapt to everything we throw at them," Amy reported as her mixed-species crew fought to disable the alien machine. but they seem confused by our tactical coordination. Their programming doesn't account for the kind of cooperative strategies we're using. The victory against the scout ship provided crucial intelligence about devourer weaknesses. The machines were incredibly advanced and adaptive, but they had been designed to fight against species that used predictable military doctrines. The combination of human tactical flexibility and alien technological capabilities created strategies the devourers couldn't predict or counter effectively. Dr. Alan Carter, the linguist who had first translated the Villani distress call, made the breakthrough that would define humanity's strategy against the devourers. While studying captured machine components, he realized that the artificial intelligence controlling them was based on mathematical models that assumed logical, self-preserving behavior from their enemies. They can't understand sacrifice, Alan explained to the Strategy Council. Their programming assumes that all organic life will prioritize individual survival above everything else. When we make decisions that put the group's survival ahead of personal safety, their tactical algorithms break down. The final preparations took place on a scale the galaxy had never seen. Fleets from over 200 worlds gathered under human strategic command, creating the largest military force in recorded galactic history. The ships ranged from massive Krex battlecruisers retrofitted with human weapons to tiny ethereal scout vessels that could phase between dimensions. Colonel Hayes, now promoted to General of Galactic Forces, stood on the bridge of the flagship Unity as the combined fleet prepared for the coming battle. Around him worked beings from dozens of species, all united by the human concept that some things were worth fighting and dying for. Sir, long-range sensors are detecting the main Devourer fleet, reported Lieutenant Pete Barnes, who had been promoted to navigation chief for the combined fleet. They're moving in the geometric formations we expected, but their numbers are larger than our worst-case projections. Hayes nodded calmly. The coming battle would determine whether organic life survived in this part of the galaxy, but he felt confident in what they had built together. Humanity had answered a desperate plea for help and discovered their true purpose among the stars, not as conquerors, but as the species that taught others how to fight for something greater than themselves. All ships, this is General Hayes, he announced over the fleet communication system. We're about to face an enemy that wants to eliminate every form of organic life in the galaxy. They think we're just another species that will break when faced with overwhelming force. They're about to learn what happens when someone tells the galaxy's protectors that surrender is the only option. The response that came back from hundreds of ships and dozens of species was a war cry that echoed across space in languages from deities throughout the galaxy. But underneath the alien words was a very human concept: defiance in the face of impossible odds, and the willingness to fight not if,